Good afternoon. Thought I would show you guys my EC comic reprints. I wish I had the resources to own the actual EC comics from the 50s. I would love to. But since I don't have $1,000 or $2,000 per comic, and I really don't want comics that are completely ratty and, will disintegrate in my hands, I opt for reprints. EC did put out some hardcover collections, and I bought, I think, two of them. The problem was the pages are glossy, and because these comics are, originally published in the 50s, it's just so different. I mean, they were printed on really newspaper stock, and so a lot of the primary colors, they explode off these pages of the glossy, the hardcovers. So for me, I really prefer these which are published in the late 90s. They're not that expensive. You can find them in dollar bins, and I love them. I just think it's closer. It feels more like the real thing, and the way it sits on the page, I prefer these a lot more. So, without further ado, this is Haunt of Fear number 1. Haunt of Fear 4. Now, they definitely didn't make all of them. They didn't reprint everything that they did. One of the titles that I'd love to get my hands on is called Psychoanalysis. EC put out some really interesting titles. I believe there's one about nursing, night nurse, but Psychoanalysis, which there aren't many issues of, is definitely one I'd love to read. Haunt of Fear 13. I think reprints in general are really looked down upon by collectors, which is great for collectors such as myself who don't mind. I can't really afford to get Silver Surfer 2 or some of the older X-Men stuff, so I don't mind a reprint. I don't know. Personally, I think there's nothing wrong with buying reprints as long as you're, honest about it. You don't try to resell it as the real thing. Why not? A lot of you already know this, but one of the coolest things I think about EC Comics is they are pre-comic code. So these were cited in, I think the psychiatrist's name was Wortham. He wrote a book in the mid-50s called The Seduction of the Innocent. And the thesis is that these comics, horror comics and sci-fi comics, are part of the reason that kids were, turning to rock and roll and heroin, and it explained a lot of the bad stuff that was happening in society, which is completely ridiculous. But a lot of the stuff that takes place in these comics is cited. And there are some pretty gory stuff in some of these comics. I mean, there's rape scenes, and there's stuff that was way ahead of its time for sure. Which is a great segue into this classic Wally Wood cover. I mean, you didn't have stuff like this on magazine covers. It has elements of bondage, and it's a powerful image. Wally Wood, I think, is one of my favorite artists of all time. It's a great cover. I think a lot of collectors would say that the stuff that they were doing, both writing and art, was way ahead of its time, and still some of the greatest comic books ever made. Unfortunately, the actual issues are pretty expensive. They range from a couple hundred, depending on the issue, all the way up to 8,000, 10,000 for Gaines file copies. But they're out there. I mean, they're definitely around. You don't see these in the wild. I'm not talking about the reprints. I'm talking about the actual comics. You don't see them too much in the wild, and when you do, they're they cost a chunk of change. The stories are great, by the way. They're really just phenomenal stories. They're funny, horror. They're great. The only thing I don't like about these is every so often there'll be a story without pictures in these comics, and those stories I'm not a huge fan of. I forget what they're called, like in the vault corner or something like that. The pages are usually yellow, and it's just writing. This is an awesome cover. Jack Davis. There's a website I check every now and then, even though I can't afford the stuff, called Heritage Auctions, and some of the original artwork from these, so this cover perhaps will be available for sale. It's just cool to see that you can actually own, if you had the money, the original artwork for some of these. Another Jack Davis cover. Tales from the Crypt. What this reprint kind of looks like, it's the real thing, because it's not in the best condition, but I assure you it is a reprint. Vault of Horror 4. And you can see what I paid for this. I paid $185. Well worth it. Vault of Horror 5. It's by Johnny Craig. I don't know why I have two different reprints. It's definitely not the real thing, because this is $2. I don't know why. Interesting. They're definitely both reprints, though. Maybe this one was like with Gladstone. Maybe this was before, because it looks a little bit older than late 90s. But it's definitely a reprint. It's a $2. The originals, I think, were 10 cents, if not mistaken. Vault of 423. Weird Fantasy. The Wally Wood stuff, and this is by Feldstein, but in general, the Wally Wood stuff he did for the sci-fi covers are so incredible, so quintessential. Weird Fantasy. There's a Wally Wood cover. That's another Wally Wood cover. So awesome. Look at that attention to detail. The dog, the slingshot in the kid's back pocket. This is a classic cover. I think this might be Wallywood, but I'm not 100%. That's a Wallywood cover. It's another great Wallywood cover. If anyone from EC Comics or whoever owns the rights to these, Gladstone, whoever it is, sees this, please put more of these reprints out, especially the ones that you guys never got to. I would love to buy Psychoanalysis, but I think I'm probably in the minority there. But these reprints are really great. I appreciate the hardcovers. I love the IDW large format books. Not that I can afford them, but they're awesome to look at. But I would really like to get my hands on all the issues they ever put out, but in a similar format to the originals. In an ideal world, I'd love if they made reprints in the same size as the originals. It can be done. And that's it. So I hope you guys appreciate that. I know they're reprints, but they're still awesome. And perhaps one day I will own all of these actual comics. But until then, these reprints will suffice. Have a great day and read some comics.